And you see the strong drying trends along the eastern seaboard in the south and in southwest WA. When you break that up, we believe there's reasonable evidence, strong evidence in the west, but we believe there's increasingly strong evidence in Victoria and southern South Australia that the drying trend that you're experiencing is linked to climate change, which means that it is not going to come back to the climate that you knew pre-1990, pre-1985, about that time period when things really started drying out. So unfortunately, I think the prognosis is humans are going to have to live with this, and natural ecosystems are going to have to live with this. The third thing I think we can say with some confidence is more bushfires, and that's due to a number of reasons, not just hot weather on the day, but also the conditions that precondition vegetation to burn. And again, I don't need to tell you about what happened just about a year ago now in Victoria, 173 deaths, over $1 billion worth of damages in those terrible bushfires over that weekend. But in future, our estimate is you can expect a catastrophic fire day like that at least once every 16 years by 2020 and once every 3 to 8 years by 2050. So that means unless we mitigate climate change, in other words, mitigate greenhouse gas emissions very quickly and very effectively, basically by the middle of this century, Victoria's forests are going to burn as soon as they recover from the last burn. And that's going to have massive effects on biodiversity. Not to mention, of course, human settlements and human life. But the bulk of the talk is not about the climate science itself, and it's about the implications for Victoria's biodiversity of these changes that I've just talked about. And Kerry has kindly mentioned the book that a group of us put together over about a 2.5-year period. So this was a very exhaustive, extensive synthesis of what we know about Australia's biodiversity and climate change. I put the names of my colleagues up there who contributed quite strongly to this. I should add that we consulted right around the country, not only with scientists, but with those people who have to set policy and management for conserving biodiversity, managing natural ecosystems. And I have to say, and I would say this in other states as well, that I think Victoria is probably ahead of the game in terms of thinking creatively about how to manage biodiversity under a changing climate. And I would like to compliment the Department of Sustainability and Environment of the Victorian government for, I think, quite a leading intellectual role and management role that they're taking. And I'll refer to some of their work in just a couple minutes. Okay, the first thing we say in this book is we don't start with climate change. This is very important. We start with the current state of Australia's biodiversity. And what are the changes we see? Well, we see changes certainly at the species level, extinction, functional extinction, threatened species, and so on. Changes in relative abundance and distribution, and so on. We go far more than just extinctions to look at how ecosystems and species are changing. And you see that Victoria is actually a very mixed bag. You see areas of Victoria where you see massive changes in mammals, and you see some areas where you don't see so many changes. So Victoria is a really interesting place, very varied ecosystems and species, and also varied impacts of human stressors. It's important to note the stressors, you can read them there, you all know them. They continue to operate. As of today, 2010, they are by far the most important impact on biodiversity, much more important than climate change. But that's probably changed as the century goes on. But what are the consequences of business as usual, unmitigated scenarios of climate change for Australia's biodiversity? We looked around the country, and indeed compared it to the rest of the world. We will likely face a massive wave of extinctions by the second half of the century if we do not get on top of the mitigation issue. We listed areas at high risk in Australia. 2 of those are actually at least wholly or partly in Victoria. The Australian Alps and the Southeast Forests are both at high risk if we do not mitigate climate change. One of the things we said is we need to deal with ecological complexity and indeed climate complexity as well. A lot of the research, I'll get to this in a moment, that you may have seen on climate change and biodiversity or natural ecosystems, we think is worthless. And it's worthless for a couple of reasons. One is indirect effects are going to be most important, not the direct effects of a species' environmental envelope moving as climate moves. Extremes are far more important than averages, yet most models use average shifts in climate. You see that little graph to show how a small change in an average can mean a huge change in the number of extremes. This is what's going to hit ecosystems. Synergistic effects and surprises, non-linearities, time lags, thresholds, feedbacks. This is consistently complex system behavior This is what's going to really make the difference, and this is where we've got to get on top of the science. We haven't today. So as I said, I think 90% of research you may see if you Google climate change and biodiversity actually has little relevance for what we really need to do to manage. That was a pretty sobering conclusion. Here's an example of a surprise from Victoria. These are little penguins. It turns out they've had no experience of fire, and so have no instinct to flee when things start burning around them. They simply stand there, preen their feathers, and get burnt in their nests. So as climate change warms and dries the environment around the penguins, the risk of fire increases. This is not esoteric or theoretical. This is happening now. And again, it shows you the surprise. No model would have ever predicted that an organism like a little penguin would not have the instinct to flee a fire. So this is what's going to happen. Species and ecosystems will be put into environments they haven't experienced. And we as scientists actually don't know how they're going to respond. This was truly a surprise. So, the approach, biodiversity in a changing climate, I've made a pretty dire picture that we absolutely don't know scientifically what we really should do. So the point we make is the business as usual approach and modifications of what we've been doing in the past probably aren't going to work very well. We're really sailing into new areas of knowledge, new areas of management, and so on. So what we're saying is we need to back off a minute from trying to manage a bit too tightly and proactively. We need to be agile. We need to be adaptable. We need to learn as we try to manage. And we need to focus more on resilience and indeed transformation rather than trying to manage for species and ecosystems where they are now. So we need new perspectives and goals. This is going to be hard for a lot of people who are interested in conservation, I think, to understand, because the magnitude and rate of climate change is beyond anything we as fully modern humans have experienced or the ecosystems from which we derive our services. Point number one, we cannot go back to a 1770 pre-European world. A lot of our conservation measures now are designed toward moving back or trying to get back to what the world was like when the traditional custodians were the only humans here managing it. We can't do that anymore. We need to expect novel ecosystems, species moving to different places, different compositions in ecosystems. So we need to develop policy and management for change. We need to look at fluid landscapes, agile managers, maximizing diversity in a dynamic sense, not saying we need to keep species where they are now or protect ecosystems where they are now, because they already are on the move, and they'll be increasingly on the move. So what can we do? Some rules of thumb. You can read them there. Just because of our ecological knowledge in general, we can expect some things. Fragmentation of generalists, general extinction of narrow-ranged endemics, spread of generalists, and so on. You can see what this is. The important one, I think, is decoupling of species-species interactions. So what do we need to do? Flexible policy and management approaches. Reconsider objectives, I've said that. We need consensus building in society to accept these altered objectives. But also we need a greater focus on risk assessments, on active adaptive management, and so on. This is what I mean by active adaptive management. You can go through that cycle. It means we actually design experiments in the management, not just experiments in the science. So we try new types of management, and we have to accept that they will not always succeed. We have to be much less harsh on our policy people, our governments, our politicians, because they're also in unknown territory. They're going to have to try something. The only failure is if we don't learn from what we're trying to do. Okay, this is, I think, my next to last slide. This is Victoria. I think it leads the way in what I call, or we call, integrated regional approaches. We need to look beyond traditional conservation to look at socioeconomic trajectories, the sea change and tree change movement, demographic trends, agricultural planning zones, etc. We need to think about not multi-use, but multi-purpose landscapes. Because I said, organisms will be on the move, ecosystems will try to reconstruct themselves and reconfigure themselves as they move. They're not going to respect national park boundaries. They're not going to respect our planning. So we need to put together socioeconomic trends, different uses of landscapes, and so on. So those are the final key messages that I'm going to have for you. We need to build resilience and facilitate transformation. And by facilitating transformation, we need to make space for species and ecosystems to move and reassemble and self-adjust. And I think Victorian thinking has actually been in the lead on this, certainly in the DSC. We need to strengthen conservation efforts at all levels. We can't forget the existing stressors. We have to keep working at controlling invasive species and so on.